Scholars, welcome to Chapter 3 of Computer-Mediated Communication. Today we're going to be talking about impersonal communication, or in other words, we'll be talking about early theories and perspectives of CMC that was really about just getting the job done. And so with no further ado, let's jump right into it. So first of all, what is impersonal communication? Impersonal communication are those messages and interactions we have often every day that don't have a lot of relational meaning. And relational here does not necessarily mean a significant other or even a dear family member. Any relational meaning where we're working to have a connection with someone. That could be in the workplace. When you talk with your boss about shift scheduling, you're trying to work through a lot of information. There's relational meaning there, or at least task meaning. So when you're dealing with those sorts of interactions, those are going to be interpersonal or organizational in nature. Impersonal really is it's empty of relational development. There may be content and it may be task focused, but not in the sense of an organizational task, but just getting something done. So to be more clear, let's talk about some examples of that. One of the most common places we have impersonal interactions is interacting with a lot of the service workers that we have in our daily lives. So when you're getting a coffee with your barista or getting checked out of the grocery store, talking to the clerk, a lot of these are impersonal communications. You may have discussions about how the weather is or what's going on or your favorite local sports team, but you're not really developing a relationship with that individual. You're just sort of having some usually scripted conversations. And I don't mean reading off a teleprompter, but rather some sort of almost automatic communication. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? Great. Thanks for asking. You're not really actively caring about that other person. And if you want to see whether or not you're actually having an impersonal interaction, and we have these sometimes even with colleagues that we pass in the hallway, next time you see a friend of yours walking through the quad and they say, hey, how are you? Respond with something they wouldn't expect. Gosh, my rash is flaring up. It's really awkward, but if they just say, well, great, good to hear it, and keep walking, they weren't really having an interpersonal interaction with you. They weren't really listening to what you were saying. And so back to it, the baristas, the hotel staff, when you check in and check out, oftentimes impersonal communication. Now, these are really important functionally because we have to get our coffee or check into the hotel or park our car, whatever that interaction is. And so there can be a task associated with this, but there's no relational development to it. Now, again, these are not unique to online communication. We have lots and lots of offline examples about these, but we need to talk about what impersonal communication is to understand some of the early theorizing and understanding of what computer-mediated communication was. So early CMC, up until the late 80s, early 90s, took what's been called a cues filtered out perspective. In other words, early days of interaction, there were so few bits of data that we could get about the person who we were talking with that we felt we really couldn't get a sense of who they are. And so the idea behind this is that CMC innately filters out cues. When you and I talk to each other face to face, we have a lot of information besides just our verbal delivery exchange. You can see me, you can see what my clothing is, you can see my posture, our use of all those icks that we talked about in our introductory communication courses. Proxemics, the use of space and distance, and chronemics, the use of time, haptics and kinesics. All those disappear in early CMC, where we were just stuck to text-based interaction. All we had was our verbal delivery. And even then, a lot of the verbal cues that we get, things such as tone, volume, intonation, cadence, all those were filtered out as well. They disappeared, and we were just stuck with the transcript, with just the text. And so when we lose access to all those rich cues about you, it results in this sort of constrained and limited perception about who you are. In fact, cues are really important because they tell us who we are. When you go meet someone for the first time, you draw a lot of information, even beyond from what they say, from how are they dressed, are they holding a bloody steak? This could mean they're either a vampire slayer or a serial killer. Why not both? But just even before they talk with you, you get all this information. Online, where you're just a username, if that, and some text messages, we lose all about that. And so these cues, these cues to identity, cues to our communication and interaction, because they're sort of throttled back in this primarily text-based early CMC, led to the development of something called social presence theory. And social presence theory builds on that CFO paradigm and says that because CMC filters out all these socio-emotional cues. So think about facial expressions. You can tell what someone's feeling generally by their facial expressions. Do they look happy? Do they look sad? Do they know it? Clap your hands. But just from looking at someone's facial expression, you really quickly get a lot of information about them, how they're feeling, how they're reacting to the things you're saying. It's this huge sort of cornucopia of socio-emotional cues. You know a lot about them, a lot about what they're feeling, about how they're feeling in relation to you in this conversation. But because CMC filters those out, it constrains those cues and limits the amount of information we can get about someone. Social presence theory says that without them, communication online is inherently interpersonal. We're just sort of two robots talking, these atonal, unemotional, just exchanging bits of data, bits of information. And so it goes from, if you're asking someone out, hey, do you want to go out on Thursday? They say, sure, I'd love to. Where the first party you can hear their nervousness and the second party you can hear their excitement. It goes to this very monotone, do you want to go out on Thursday? I would love to. And so you can't hear the tone of voice, and this innately leads to impersonal interactions. And so a lot of early theorizing was built on what Shorts and colleagues built from social presence theory, which was by virtue of being online, we cannot have interpersonal relationships. We cannot have meaningful relationships. And all interactions are almost by default impersonal. This led to early CMC research really being focused on task communication, getting the job done. And that's where a lot of early CMC was focused. So we talked in chapter 1 about sort of some of the developments of technology. We see this again here where it starts off in the workplace. This was early CMC was really used to exchange information between people in the workplace. And the information here was just that, task-focused information, because with the assumption that we can't have any sort of relationship or feelings or socio-emotional information online, it was that task information, which is what it was for. This led to one of the first true theories of CMC, media richness theory. Dr. Lingell proposed this, and really what media richness theory is, ultimately, it's a theory of choice. How do we, in this tapestry of communication channels we have available to us, how do we choose which ones to use? If I need to send you, my coworker, a message, I could walk down the hall and tell you in person. I could call you. I could send you a memo. I could fax it to you. I could send you an actual piece of mail. I have lots of choices. Which one's the right one to use, and how do we define right? And that's really what Daft and Lingell were out to try to understand. And the development of media richness theory was in response to that, understanding how we pick amongst all these increasing number of channels we have available in the workplace. Media richness theory was really developed and predicated on two different dimensions. And media richness theory says that all media can be built up in this 2x2 typology from uncertainty and equivocality. And these are really big words that we'll explain here in a minute. But basically what media richness says is that by understanding the communication needs, in other words, by looking at uncertainty and equivocality of the situation you're looking at, we can then plot out what is the correct channel to use. And again, correct here, meaning the one that most effectively transmits information. Now, there's certainly things like just personal choice that may go into this. So we may find, according to media richness theory, that I like face-to-face interactions. That does not mean it's the correct one with respect to our informational needs. So let's maybe start by digging into what are uncertainty and equivocality, these two dimensions by which we make the decision about channel choice. Uncertainty is usually defined by not having a clear or well-defined problem. If you've got a very well-defined problem, you're not in this situation of uncertainty. Uncertainty is resolved through explicit information. And so some of the common examples we get in the workplace are things like, what's my schedule? What's my schedule is a very clearly defined question. Next week, what hours am I scheduled to work? There is a very clearly defined answer. You're working from 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday. Questions like, what were your sales in the third quarter of last year? We know exactly what that question means and that there is a singular correct answer to it. And we don't need a lot more clarity on what that is. We might ask something as simple as gross or net, but at the end of the day, it's just what's that number for your Q3 earnings. So it's this very clear, well-defined problem, and we resolve the problem with explicit information by sending off and saying, here's your schedule, or third quarter earnings were 27,000, or whatever your numbers are. The other thing we're focused on in media richness theory is equivocality. And Daft and Lingell originally proposed this using equivocality, which really means ambiguity. And I've seen a lot of papers since then talk about media richness theory with respect to uncertainty and ambiguity, because I think equivocality may have sort of too big a word to bandy about sometimes. Works for scholars, not so much in casual conversation. And ambiguity means the problem you're trying to solve itself may not even be clear. In other words, you may not only do you not know the answer, you may not know the actual question to lead to that answer. To resolve equivocality, we've got to ask additional questions to clarify. Before I can ask you the question that I want answered, I need to ask questions about the question that I actually need to get there. And so if you've ever had a question in class where you're thinking, gosh, I don't know how to phrase this, or I'm not really sure what I'm asking, students sometimes will say, I'm confused. By what? Kind of everything. That's an equivocality situation. Not, I missed the definition for this term. That's uncertainty. Clearly, you know what you don't know, and there's a well-defined parameters around what would resolve that uncertainty. I don't know the meaning of ambiguity. Ambiguity is unclear problems. Cool, done. Equivocality is, I'm just confused. I don't fully understand this thing. And the answer to that question of I'm confused is, where are you having the most problems, or where was the last part that you understood? Because I'm confused is a tough question to answer, because I don't know about what you're confused or where you're struggling or where you're having problems. And we may need to dig in order to answer your question. First, ask some clarifying questions. Media richness theory was developed along this sort of 2x2 axis that follows. And so we often see, when talking about media richness theory, a lot of images like the one on your screen now. And the idea is that what effective communication is, and again, effective communication is a somewhat mercurial term, depending on the context and who you're asking and who the scholar even is. What do we mean by effective can be a challenging thing. In media richness theory, effectiveness means, did you select the medium that helps you meet your information richness needs? And so we see in situations that are low in ambiguity and low in uncertainty, really lean mediums, those that may not have a lot of room for fast question and answer responses, not a lot of feedback, narrow bandwidth. And again, this is not bandwidth like how many megabytes are you transferring per minute. It's not a technical thing. Bandwidth here is basically how many cues are you transferring. And so the richer the channel, the better it is for more complex questions. And so back to it, when we're in this low ambiguity, low uncertainty situation, lean channels work really well. Lean channels are those that don't have room for rapid feedback, don't have a lot of bandwidth, tend to be very fixed. And we often see these in the workplace in the forms of things like letters, email, and policy and procedure manuals. When you first start a job, you probably have a lot of lean channels coming at you. You're doing things like watching a training video, reading through a lot of paperwork, reading through a lot of training manuals, policy and procedure manuals, and so on. The reason for these are there's not necessarily, at least to start off, an interest in things like questions. If you have a question, wait a minute, it will probably be answered later on. Or posting schedules. The schedule on your calendar for work is a lean channel. If you've got questions about the schedule, you may need to use a richer channel, but they're not really interested in feedback. The schedule is posted. Here it is. This answers your question about when are you scheduled. Low ambiguity, low uncertainty. Alternately, when we get into the other quadrant, the high uncertainty, high ambiguity, now is where we need richer channels. We need more socio-emotional exchange, faster exchange, more cues to help understand this information. So this is where we're going to go to things like telephone, which we still don't have the visual, but at least we've got the audio cues. We can get things like tonality and inflection, pauses, sort of the paralinguistic communication, those sorts of cues. Video conferencing, now we have video in, so we get facial expressions, gestures, and face-to-face, where now we can do things like touch or co-orientation. We can look together at the schedule and both point to something and say, well, that's what I meant, and pointing at it as the referent. In these richer channels, it allows us to take the time and use the faster feedback of these channels to further reduce ambiguity, and in doing so, work towards answering that question, resolving that uncertainty. And so it's that continuum going from low richness channels in the low ambiguity, low uncertainty, to high richness channels and the high uncertainty, high ambiguity conditions. That's really where we get to this realm of effective communication. Where we have inefficient use of media or poor selection of media is when we're not meeting those criteria. So for example, you have a high uncertainty, low ambiguity question. When you use a face-to-face channel, it's inappropriate. It doesn't mean that by going to your boss and asking face-to-face to tell you your schedule for the week doesn't mean you won't get an answer, but it is kind of burdensome. Now they have to take time away. They're not really going, you're not going to ask questions to clarify why are they telling you when it's posted on the bulletin board over there. Alternately, when you send your boss an email that says, can you fill me in what I missed on Monday's meeting? Well, no, there's a lot of information there. You're going to have clarifying questions if you don't understand. That's not really something where we can just send a letter, even if they've got a transcript of that meeting. That's why we should be why we have meetings, to interact, discuss, ask questions, clarify, reduce that ambiguity. And so not matching the correct channel to the correct condition leads to poor task-focused communication. And this is the central premise of media richness theories, finding the right channel for the right job. And the goal ultimately is to fit the channel information to the need. This is why, so for example, at the start of your semester, hopefully all of your classes gave you syllabi. Now, I know as a student, you have 4 or 5, some of you 6 or 7 courses, you have that many syllabi to go through, and a lot of it's the same boilerplate language. Here is the class schedule, here is, I don't mean like what we're doing, but just the days that the class is held. Here is the plagiarism policy, here's the student accommodations section, here's some stuff about grading policies, which the grades are normal, but how we calculate grades may be different by the class, but they all kind of look the same. But the reason we give these to you is to have that basically top 20 list of questions we know students are going to ask. We put it in that document because we know there are questions you're going to ask. Things like, how is my grade calculated? When do we meet? What should I read for this week? So we put that in there because we're expecting you to have those questions, and we're proactively answering them. And we're also not expecting for a lot of feedback. When I plan out my semesters, if we're going to do interpersonal on this Thursday, if that doesn't work for a student in my class, that doesn't really matter. We're not going to change the whole semester because one student's not making that day. I'm not looking for a lot of feedback on my calendar. And so we post it in these things. So when you start a new job, again, we have a lot of places we're going to have these lean channels, things like bulletin board in the workroom. Here's the standardized information everybody has to know. So in the United States, we have things like, this is where OSHA postings are. Our legally required office safety policies have to be posted. We'll have things like upcoming events for work, schedules, posted to the bulletin board. The bulletin board is this lean medium. Alternately, bosses that have open door policies, if you have questions, stop on by. Much richer channel. Questions like, hey boss, what do I need to do to set myself up to succeed and get a promotion in the next 2 years? There's not a simple answer to that. Maybe there is, make $100,000 in sales. I don't know. But most of the time that's going to lead to what type of promotion are you looking for? What are you doing now? How can we get you there? There's some back and forth needed. So again, media richness theory is really looking for what's the right fit to this channel. If you walk into your boss's office and say, what time am I scheduled on Thursday? They may well be able to tell you, but at the same time, it's going to be a little bit awkward. And some of that tension you're feeling is because that's not an effective means of communication. It's not worth your time. It's not worth their time for just exchanging data. Again, back to the sort of theme of today, the just here to do a job. This is why a lot of early CMC was actually to facilitate databases, just exchanging essentially Excel files. These, how much did we make this year? How much did we sell this year? Where is our inventory going? because there's a lot of information. There's huge bits of information in large multinational organizations, Excel files and databases. But at the same time, as much as there is a lot of information, it's very clear what that information is. We know what our inventory is, how much it costs, what our margins were, what our cost factors were. So since these are all standardized, even though there's a lot of it, that's a very appropriate medium for it. Some of you may have seen things like quarterly business estimates, so third quarter reviews and annual reviews, the financial disclosures that an organization gives. And if you look through them, and especially the debit and credit ledgers, there's a lot of numbers there, and it can look really daunting at first. But the reason that it's there is just, this is the company reporting, what did it spend, what did it make, what did it lose this year, what were the profits, what were the expenses. If you know how to read financial statements and quarterly performance reports, those are very standardized bits of information that an investor or organizational stakeholders would want to see. And that's why getting those quarterly or end of year reports from those businesses are in printed form or online PDFs increasingly, because that information is really standardized. The numbers may change year to year, but what those numbers represent, again, what our expenditures were, what our assets are, those are the same year after year. And so if you go between multiple businesses' annual earnings reports, again, the numbers will change, but the columns, what those numbers represent, are very, very standardized for accounting practices. This is meeting the channel to fit the information need, because as much as there's a lot of information, and it may be very complex in the sense of needing some financial or accounting wherewithal to make sense of it, at the end of the day, those are very standardized, i.e. low uncertainty needs. Finally, again, what's effective communication? This is why so many of your faculty members, when you ask them questions, will get exasperated and go, it's in the syllabus. Because we've already provided you that answer. You're trying to use, in addition to not reading the syllabus, you're trying to use a rich medium to answer a low richness need. And that's where that tension comes from. Why am I taking up time to repeat to you the thing that's already been documented? You have a very discrete question, and there's a very clear way to get it. And this is just not an effective match to that information need. So if your goal of going to the professor is to you stop by the professor's office hours and you want to get to know them and develop a relationship and a rapport, that's great. Rapport is a wonderful reason for richer channels. But starting off by saying, when is exam 2? Not getting you there, because that's not building the rapport. That's just asking a very low ambiguity, high uncertainty question that's easily answered and doesn't fit the information environment. So there's these ways to have sort of good conversations and bad conversations, and maybe it's an awkward transition. But from here, let's talk about talking with robots. Now, this is not a talking with robots class. There are entire different fields or subfields of the communication discipline related to human-computer interaction, HCI, and human-robot interaction, HRI. But in the domain of impersonal communication, we are going to talk about this a little bit, because there are some facets of this that are increasingly coming up even in CMC. One of the dominant paradigms that we're guided by is the computers are social actors paradigm, the CASA paradigm. The CASA paradigm has been around for about 40 years now, and looking at how people think of and interact with technologies, and specifically computers, but technologies more broadly. And sort of the strange example of this that many of you have, for those of you with cars, we often anthropomorphize our cars. We treat our cars as if they're living things. Especially for our first cars, we will often give them names, and we'll talk about them as if they had some sort of agency, some ability to affect things. Oh yeah, my car was acting up this morning. It didn't choose to act up. I mean, there may be a mechanical reason for this, but it wasn't behaving in an inexplicable way. There should be, as hard as it may be to diagnose, and I'm not a car person, a way to figure out what's making that noise and why. And so anytime we've talked about these inanimate objects as if they're sort of animate things that have their own agency and willpower, we're lending ourselves to the CASA paradigm. And increasingly, we do this with computers. And so we'll talk here a little bit about how we interact with computers, and that may be devices, that may be robots. But again, that's there's a different sub area for it here to get into the nuance of that. But importantly, these human-computer interactions that we have are also innately, impersonal communication. That slide is misspelled, I apologize. They're innately impersonal communication because you're not talking with someone. You're interacting with an algorithm as increasingly advanced and complex as it is, but there's not another person there. It's not that human-to-human interaction. And yet, because of the CASA paradigm, a lot of the mental scripts that we have and we follow about how to have an interaction can really be guided by that. And even though we're having an impersonal interaction, they're still guided by fundamental natures of humans. And so the CASA paradigm says that when we interact with computers as people, we think about them and engage with them as such, as people, sometimes even if we know they're computers. And this has been evidenced and explored in the communication literature a couple different ways. One of the ways we've seen this is just textual exchanges. And we see increasingly computers interacting with us just through text, not through some sort of embodiment or visual imagery, but just a text response. And we've seen this in a couple different ways, everything from virtual companions, so you've got a chatbot. We've seen this with virtual therapists. We did a study several years ago. We were looking at how people present themselves online and how feedback affected that self-presentation. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about identity shift. But what was surprising was we had people interact with I shouldn't even say interact, they presented themselves and then got feedback about that presentation from purportedly a human. We had also a different set of participants self-present themselves and get feedback from a purported computer. Now the feedback was identical. We made sure that they were getting the same stuff. While those perceiving a person had given them feedback had greater effects, notably there were still effects even when the feedback was from a computer. And so if you go online and type out "Dear Diary, today I was very brave," and the diary program spits back out, "Yes, you are a very, very brave person," that textual feedback can actually make you feel more brave. And so even though we know it's a computer, there is no person there, there is no presumed person there, it's just the algorithm spitting stuff back out based on what you've typed in, that feedback still acts to a lesser degree, but still to the same way as if a human gave you that feedback. And so again, it's impersonal, but still impactful, and we need to consider it. Another place we increasingly see the CASA paradigm manifest is through virtual agents online. Now, agents here are computer programs that you interact with, but there's no actual person behind them. It's all done, again, by an algorithm, by the system, and you may not immediately know that there's no person there. And so we have a lot of places. I've seen them on airlines, I've seen them on online retail, but something pops up that says, "Hey, can I help you?" And you start interacting. So on the screen here, you see this interaction for a customer. The looks like a person pops up. "Hi, how can I help you?" Customer says, "I'm looking for new jogging shoes." The agent says, "Oh, would you like to check out our newest collection?" Now you don't know if the agent, that message is coming back from an actual person, some Clyde in a warehouse somewhere or a computer farm, or if it's all just done by a bot. If it's done by a person, we call it an avatar. It's a virtual representation of an actual person with whom you're interacting. A lot of these agents that we see online now are just that. They're agents. They may look, and again, you see this in the picture here, it's depicting a person, and sort of sound. We're increasingly getting them to text much more like humans would text in sort of natural language. But often on these sites, you're actually talking with an agent, with a bot, with a computer program. And again, we tend to talk to these bots kind of in the same way we would talk to our friends, or at least to another customer service representative. And the interaction that we can have like that when we're getting the visual cues that this is a person rather than a robot. It's the reason we have a person here depicted rather than just some automaton. That can help us with our interaction, kind of knowing how to talk to that person. And even when we can flat out see it's a robot, and science fiction literature is riddled with us talking with robots and droids from C-3PO in Star Wars to Rosie the Robot in the Jetsons to Bender in Futurama. But even when we know it's a robot, if it sounds human to talk to, it still has these sort of interactive properties. And we actually see robots like this often used in therapy. The picture here is interacting with an older person, but we see a lot of things like assisted living homes, senior centers, bringing robots in. One of the biggest problems that seniors will have, especially when living within sort of assisted living or in homes, is isolation. It gets really lonely, and the only people they see are themselves and maybe their neighbors and some of the folks working there. And so scholars and practitioners, therapies will bring in robots just for someone to talk to. And the reason the robot can be someone to talk to is because, unlike a person, the robot won't judge. The robot won't get bored. The robot won't say, "This is the fourth time I've heard that story, old man, stop talking about that." And so it can give you this sort of safe space to interact. And the person here obviously knows it's a robot, but if it sounds human enough, we start anthropomorphizing it and treating it as a human. And this has been leveraged already to do things like depression or isolation therapy. And so the CASA paradigm, even though it's impersonal in the sense there is no other person there, has really been used to help understand how people interact in a mediated environment, or at least with the medium itself. That's going to be it for today, for this chapter. I don't want you to stop thinking about this, though, because there's some things to consider. So let's start off with, is the cues filtered out paradigm still relevant? We'll talk about this in chapter 4, but pretty quickly the CFO paradigm was pushed to the side as we realized, as many of you thought reading through this chapter, well, of course we can have interpersonal interactions online. Of course we can have meaningful relationships. But does that mean that the CFO paradigm should just be thrown out wholesale? No use. Does it have any use in your own life? What could it help you explain or predict? Think about, why do we spend time covering this? Does it still have utility? Think about how we choose channels. Assume that you graduated and you're now a man. Maybe you're still doing this in your concurrent work. You've got a job as a manager and you need to fire an employee. According to MRT, now not what you just personally want or what seems like the right thing to do, but according to media richness theory, what's the correct channel to fire someone? And importantly, and I think the answer here can be a lot of different things, but more importantly is, why that answer? Link your response to the tenets of media richness theory. Lastly, spend some time this week, just as you go through life, keeping an eye out for potential virtual agents. I think these things crop up a lot more than we may initially presume. Again, I've seen them pop up when I'm doing everything from booking travel arrangements to even my library. Will immediately have, or quickly after I log on, have a little virtual agent pop up. One of the places we see them now is drive-throughs, because drive-throughs can to a great degree be automated. We've seen the introduction of essentially chatbots with voice synthesizers interacting. So is the person you're interacting with at the drive-through actually a person? They may be in the store, they may be at a remote location, or they may be a robot. And then on social media, how many bots do we see interacting on various channels from Facebook to Twitter to TikTok and providing information or misinformation? We'll talk more about this when we talk in the persuasion chapter. More importantly, whether or not you think that is a person or a robot or a system, how does even asking that question affect how you think about and interact with it? By virtue of you wondering if the pop-up library assistant on your local library, by even thinking about, is that really a human behind it, does that affect how you interact with it? There's a lot going on here, and we'll quickly move away from the impersonal approaches to CMC, but I think there's an important foundation here we need to remember, because early on, CMC was just about getting stuff done. It was about the task, getting the task accomplished. And we'll move on from there, but it's a really important historical root. So thanks so much for joining us today. This has been Chapter 3, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.